What if I told you there once lived a king so physically broken, so mentally fragile, and so disturbingly malformed that his very existence felt like a cosmic mistake? His name was Charles II of Spain, and to the people of his time, he wasn't just a tragic ruler. He was living proof of what happens when power, arrogance, and centuries of incestuous ambition collide. His subjects whispered that he was cursed by the devil. His priests performed public exorcisms. His wives wept behind closed doors. And when royal doctors finally cut open his body after death, what they found was so grotesque. It seemed to confirm every nightmare his court had ever feared. But this wasn't the work of black magic. It wasn't sorcery or possession. The truth was far more terrifying. Charles was the end result of a dynasty so obsessed with purity that it turned its own bloodline into a prison. This is the true story of how Europe's most powerful royal family didn't fall by rebellion or foreign invasion, but by its own hand. Welcome to Medieval Uncovered, and the horrifying descent of Charles II begins with something as simple and as damning as a jaw that couldn't close. Imagine this: you're a foreign ambassador, summoned to meet the most powerful man in the Spanish Empire. You expect grandeur, regality, majesty. Instead, the king walks in, and he can't even close his mouth. His lower jaw juts out so far it looks like it's trying to escape his face. His lips never meet. His teeth don't align. His mouth hangs open like a broken hinge, and when he tries to speak, it sounds like a drowning man gargling words you can't understand. This wasn't a rare deformity. It was a legacy. Historians now call it mandibular prognathism, but for centuries it was known simply as the Habsburg jaw, the grotesque trademark of Europe's most dangerously inbred royal family. For over 200 years, the Habsburgs married their own blood: cousins, uncles, nieces. Their family tree didn't branch. It curled inward like a snake devouring its tail. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents, also uncle and niece. By the time Charles was born, his genetics resembled those of an isolated island tribe, dangerously lacking diversity. A modern genetic analysis estimated his homozygosity at over 25%. For comparison, most people today are under 1%. The result? A face so deformed that palace chefs had to mash all his food into a pulp. Pureed meats, blended vegetables, soup through a straw, solid food just spilled from his mouth. Royal banquets became pitiful scenes, with servants gently wiping broth and drool from their king's chin. Worse still, his speech was a garbled mess. Foreign dignitaries brought interpreters, not to translate language, but to interpret his slurred, mushy utterances. One letter from his mother, Queen Mariana, reveals her deepest fear: that her son might die in his sleep, choking on his own tongue. That's the price they paid for royal purity. A boy who could barely eat, barely speak, and barely survive. And tragically, the twisted legacy didn't end with his jaw. It was just the beginning. Charles II of Spain wasn't merely deformed on the outside. His entire body was a collapsed cathedral, grand in title, yet hollow in function. By age 35, he appeared more like a haunted child than a monarch, trapped in a frame that had never properly developed. Standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall, with limbs so thin they resembled faint pencil sketches, rather than muscle and bone, and a grotesquely oversized head perched on a neck too frail to support it, his figure was a physical testament to dynastic decay. Eyewitnesses described him as perpetually hunched, his back bent like a man decades older, with a sunken chest and an unsteady, shuffling gait. He didn't learn to walk until nearly 8 years old, an age when other boys were chasing dogs in courtyards or dueling with wooden swords. Charles was still crawling across marble floors. But this wasn't just weakness, it was systemic collapse. His royal tutors, tasked with preparing him to rule an empire, found themselves facing a tragic impossibility. One of them would later remark, "Trying to educate the king was like pouring water into a basket. It simply would not stay." Yet Charles wasn't indifferent. He longed to learn, adored his mother, and sought her approval with a quiet desperation. But his mind, like his body, was fragile, damaged by a condition modern historians believe to be hydrocephalus, in which fluid builds in the skull, putting pressure on brain tissue and stunting cognitive development. Combined with the staggering genetic consequences of generations of inbreeding, it likely left Charles with permanent intellectual impairments. Emotionally, he functioned like a toddler trapped in a man's body, frequently overwhelmed, prone to outbursts, and often sitting in eerie silence, disconnected from the world around him. He mimicked others to get by, clapping when they clapped, laughing when they laughed, always slightly out of sync. And yet, despite all of this, Charles ruled the Spanish Empire, not because he was fit to rule, but because the Habsburgs could imagine no alternative. They had long known their bloodline was decaying, had seen the signs written on the bodies of their children, but the thought of marrying outside the royal circle was unthinkable. Better a broken heir than a diluted one. And so Charles, physically weakened, mentally impaired, and utterly unprepared for kingship, became the final tragic expression of a dynasty that valued purity over survival, tradition over truth. In monarchies, kings are born for one purpose above all: to continue the line. But Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, couldn't even fulfill that most basic duty. His infertility wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical crisis waiting to erupt. By his 20s, Charles was visibly deteriorating, mentally and physically, yet the dynasty still needed an heir. Out of desperation, they married him to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a bright and graceful 17-year-old French princess who expected majesty but found herself shackled to a broken man. Their wedding night was a quiet catastrophe. Marie-Louise left in tears, Charles confused and helpless. Historians now believe he suffered from hypogonadism, his body underdeveloped, his reproductive organs infantile, incapable of sexual function. Yet in a world where a king's virility was sacred, no one dared blame him. Instead, Marie-Louise bore the weight, subjected to humiliating fertility rituals, potions, and religious superstitions. She knew the truth, but couldn't speak it, and it crushed her spirit. By the 1690s, it was undeniable. Charles would never father a child. With the Spanish Empire sprawling across Europe and the Americas, the lack of an heir sent shockwaves through royal courts. Secret treaties were signed, alliances shifted, and armies quietly prepared. Europe was holding its breath, waiting for his death to ignite war. And at the centre stood Charles, too frail to stand, too diminished to rule, and too cursed by his lineage to stop what was coming. In the cruelest irony, the Habsburgs' obsessive pursuit of blood purity had led not to strength, but to collapse. Charles wasn't just a failed king, he was the final echo of a dynasty that had sealed its own fate through its refusal to change. When medicine failed Charles II, the Spanish court turned to the church, and then to exorcism. By the late 17th century, with Charles's body wasting away and his mind unravelling, even the most loyal physicians had given up, replaced by priests convinced the king was possessed. Leading this spiritual crusade was Father Froilan Diaz, who believed Charles had been cursed in the womb and that his suffering came not from genetics, but demons. Grand exorcisms were held publicly in the throne room, where nobles and ambassadors watched as Charles screamed, vomited holy relics, convulsed, and at times struck his head against stone columns. These rituals became increasingly violent and surreal, with Diaz eventually purging the palace itself, burning furniture, accusing servants of witchcraft, and bathing rooms in holy water. Yet the king only worsened. Some historians believe Charles genuinely thought he was possessed, his fragile mind easily manipulated by the weight of ritual. Others argue he was a pawn, used by the church and court to buy time for a crumbling monarchy. By 1699, Diaz claimed to have expelled 47 demons, each blamed for a specific affliction. But Charles, unlike a famously exorcised boy in 1949 who recovered, would not survive because his torment was not supernatural. It was the product of centuries of inbreeding, political denial, and blind tradition. In the final days, even the church fell silent, the rituals ceased, and reality crept in. No miracle was coming. When Charles II of Spain died on November 1st, 1700, the Spanish court was torn between relief and dread. Relief that his tortured life had ended, and dread over what his death would unleash. For decades he had been nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched One, a label meant to explain away his physical deformities and cognitive decline. But the truth, revealed in a rare royal autopsy, was far more horrifying than any superstition. His heart was barely the size of a walnut, his lungs were diseased and gangrenous, his brain was swollen with fluid, revealing hydrocephalus and degeneration, his intestines were decaying, and his genitals were underdeveloped, confirming his lifelong infertility. Dr. Jerónimo de la Fuente y Pierola, the physician who led the autopsy, concluded, "It is a miracle this body sustained life. It contained not a single organ in healthy state." This was no curse. It was the natural result of centuries of inbreeding, as the Habsburg dynasty tried to control power by controlling blood. In life, Charles had been mocked as weak and monstrous. In death, he became a medical omen. Rather than confront the scientific truth, many in Europe doubled down on myth, calling him the Child King, the Ghost Emperor, or the Man with the Walnut Heart. But his body told a darker, undeniable story. That unchecked legacy, without adaptation, leads to collapse. His death didn't just end a lineage, it ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that claimed over 400,000 lives. Charles II ruled nothing, changed nothing, and left no heir, yet his broken body reshaped Europe. His final legacy was not royal triumph, but biological tragedy. So what can we truly take away from the tragic life of Charles II? He wasn't just a historical curiosity or a grotesque footnote in a forgotten dynasty. He was a mirror held up to the dangers of power left unchecked and tradition followed blindly. Charles wasn't born a monster. He was forged by centuries of royal inbreeding and a system that valued bloodline over humanity. He became king not because he was fit to rule, but because the machine of monarchy demanded an heir, no matter the cost. His life was a slow unravelling, from the infertility and the failed marriage to the desperate exorcisms and the grotesque autopsy. And yet, at no point did anyone have the courage to stop the cycle. They clothed him in robes, crowned him with ceremony, and demanded he play a role his body and mind could never support. In the end, Charles II wasn't cursed by witches. He was betrayed by the very people and systems sworn to protect him. His death marked not just the end of a king, but the collapse of a worldview. Because when legacy becomes a prison, and symbols are mistaken for strength, empires rot from within. Charles II stands as a solemn reminder that power without self-examination leads to ruin, and that even the mightiest traditions must adapt or die. His story is more than history, it's a warning, and the cracks he revealed are still relevant today.